life is a misnomer. It should be called a remembrance of life, because she was such a wonderful woman. Every day with her was a celebration of life itself. My name is Craig Cramer. I first met Mrs. Melney when her son John and I became friends back in 1983. We worked together on an ambulance company back then and just kind of felt that we were kind of two peas in a pod, so we always had a good time. I was introduced to the family as Cramer, and that's what everyone has called me ever since. Other than John and his wife Debbie, I'm not sure if Mrs. Melney or any of the other relatives even knew my first name until just now. But that's okay. They're a wonderful group of people, and I felt extremely honored when I was asked by them to speak on her life. Mrs. Melney, and I'm going to call her that because that's what I always called her, even though most of you probably knew her as Margaret, was born on March 22nd, 1928, and passed away on August 22nd, 2010. She was born to Peter and Margaret Eichert in Pontiac, Michigan, and then moved to the Bronx as an infant. She lived a few blocks from her grandparents, and anyone who knew her knows that she loved them very much. Grandma Eichert came to America from Austria-Hungary, which at that time was still a dual monarchy before it separated into the two countries. She traveled aboard a ship that had played a role in maritime history 1 year prior to her journey to America. The ship was named the RMS Carpathia, the same ship that came to the aid of the Titanic survivors. Luckily, she came here when she did. Just 5 years later, the Carpathia was sunk by the German U-boat U-55 in World War I. I was fortunate to have met Mrs. Eichert when I first met the family. Mrs. Melney lived as most people did in the Bronx, grouped together by heritage. Her childhood was spent near Yankee Stadium, and she had many wonderful times there growing up. She even celebrated in Times Square when World War II ended. While there, she began a lifelong friendship with a lady named, or young woman at that time, Adele Lippett, who cannot be here today as she is now living in California. On April 15, 1951, she married Spencer B. Melney and settled in Flushing, New York, where her daughters, Margie and Mary Ann, were born. A few years later, the family relocated to Port Chester, New York, where their son John was born. In 1972, her husband Spencer took an early retirement and they moved to Florida with their son John. She worked for Southeast Bank until she retired. After her husband Spencer passed away, she stayed in the family home in Seminole, Florida, and then she relocated to Seminole Gardens for the last 20 years of her life. On a side note, I remember the day when John and I moved her into Seminole Gardens. So we were bringing in the furniture. A gentleman walked right in and started chatting her up. He was asking her all kinds of questions. Mrs. Melney was having fun talking with him. After he left, John and I looked at each other and burst out laughing. Then we told her that he was probably the building rooster and he was checking on the new chicken in the hen house. She too laughed, and that has been the story that's been retold many times over. She was active in many clubs and organizations where she met more wonderful people, such as you who are here today. She liked playing cards, bingo, took many trips, and was an avid walker. The late 70s and early 80s were very joyous for her, as her 4 grandchildren, Richard, Brian, Paul, and Jessica, were born. Paul and Jessica actually lived with Mrs. Melney for a few years, and she also got to meet all 4 of her great-grandchildren. The last few months of her life were under hospice care at the Seminole Nursing Pavilion. During her final days, she was happy and content. While there, she received top-notch care from the staff. Mrs. Melney had the impression that she was still living in her home because many of her dear friends from Seminole Gardens would visit every day, for which the family is eternally grateful. And that's pretty much the history of Mrs. Melney. At this time, if anybody would like to stand up and say anything or relate a funny story, please feel free to come up and to do so. Did you go on last?